What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Over the past few months of making videos, I've received questions about why I use certain fishing lines, what line I use in various situations. So I figured I'd take some time here just to explain when you may want to use each type of fishing line, the scenarios you're going to encounter, the types of equipment you're using, the baits that work best with each type of line. And hopefully you'll learn something from this video and you'll get a greater insight into why I'm fishing a certain line at certain times. So the first line we're going to talk about is monofilament. This is the most common type of fishing line. This is the line that people grew up using. And honestly, I don't use it very much. Monofilament is not very visible. That's certainly a pro, but it has a ton of stretch and it floats. So really the only time I'm using monofilament is when I'm fishing topwater. Because that line floats, if you're using fluoro that sinks, you're going to have that nose pointing down eventually. And if you're using braid, because there's no stretch with braid, and you're using a bait often with treble hooks, you're going to pull that topwater bait out of the fish's mouth a lot. So really, the only time I'm using monofilament is when I'm fishing topwater. If you're using a fast-moving topwater bait, sometimes you can get away with fluoro or even braid. But again, most of the time, monofilament, topwater. But again, another pro of monofilament is that it is the cheapest of all the three options we're discussing today. So if you just want to catch a fish, you want to go to Walmart and pick up a pack of, this is Berkeley trilene, this is very cheap. It's a good way to get into fishing without spending a ton of money. So the second type of fishing line that we're going to talk about is fluorocarbon. And this happens to be canine fishing fluorocarbon. I'm using fluorocarbon in any case that I'm using treble hooks. I fish fluorocarbon when I'm using a crankbait, if I'm using a jerk bait. I use it a lot for finesse presentations too, because unlike mono, fluoro has way less stretch. It does still have a little bit of stretch, but way less than your typical monofilament. On top of that, fluorocarbon has a much thinner line diameter. So it's a much thinner line compared to monofilament. Monofilament gets very thick very quickly. So when I'm using a moving bait with treble hooks, fluorocarbon is the way I go, because if you're using braid, again, because braid has no stretch, you're running the risk of pulling those treble hooks out of the fish's mouth. And you don't really have that with fluorocarbon. If you want to spend a little bit more money, have a thinner diameter, a better product, fluorocarbon is a good middle of the ground option. Again, this is the canine fishing fluoro. And I noted earlier that fluoro sinks generally, and that's certainly the case most of the time. Canine actually makes their fluorocarbon to remain neutrally buoyant. They do have a 100% fluorocarbon that does sink too, but this particular fluorocarbon stays right in the middle of the water column. So it's a great crankbait fishing product. It's a great jerkbait product. Again, anything with lots of hooks and moving, I'm going fluorocarbon. So we've made it to the last type of line we're going to discuss in this video, and that is braid. This happens to be canine fishing super braid 9-strand, and this is in high vis yellow. So braid, like monofilament, floats. But unlike monofilament, braid has virtually no stretch. The pro of this is that you can really detect subtle bites. You can feel the difference between the bottom and a fish really well with braid. The con is that if you're trying to fish a moving bait with treble hooks on braid, it's very common to pull the hooks out of the fish's mouth because something's got to give. The other thing to note is that braid is the most visible out of all three. It's not transparent like mono or fluoro. You can really see braid. The fish can see braid. So if you're fishing braid, you often need to use a leader. I use a lot of braid to fluoro leader, but that creates an extra connection point and it creates extra work. If you break off, you need to tie a new leader. But braid is super helpful in those finesse fishing presentations. So I use a lot of braid. When I'm wading, I wade fish a lot. I can only take one rod. I'm not fishing 4, 5, 6 rods like I would if I'm on a boat or fishing a tournament. And beggars can't be choosers. So I need to cover as much ground as possible and fish as many presentations as possible. And usually braid to a fluoro leader or straight fluorocarbon gives me that broad reach here. But braid is expensive, it's situational, but it's a really important product to add to your arsenal if you really want to be able to fish every technique the correct way. Now, you do often need to use a leader for braid if you're fishing finesse, but if you're fishing grass, for example, that heavy grass, the braid gives you the ability to rip the bait through there. If I'm fishing really stained water, I will use a direct braid to lure connection because the line's not the biggest problem right now. But just keep in mind that this is a visible line, and if you're wanting to fish finesse, smaller baits, anything like that, you're going to need probably a fluorocarbon leader, but you will get that extra detection ability with braid. So I hope you guys found this video to be useful. Each line has its pros and its cons. Each line is good for certain situations. If you're looking to just get out and fish, you don't want to spend a lot of money, you can fish everything on monofilament. It's not going to be the best, but it certainly catches fish. As a kid, I caught a ton of fish on every type of bait using monofilament. I didn't have a lot of money to drop $20 on a spool of braid. But if you're more serious about fishing, you want to use the best line for the best situation, you really need to understand the differences between monofilament, fluorocarbon, and braid, because having the right line paired with the right rod and reel really makes a huge difference in hooking up with a fish and staying connected to that fish. Until next time, tied lines.